Now welcome back everyone to Web Development Module 2 Lesson 2. In today's lesson we are going to be covering JavaScript data types as well as variables, and this is quite important because it's going to lay the foundation of a lot of the code that we are going to be writing in future lessons. Now let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. First of all, we will be starting off with JavaScript data types. And again, this is quite important because JavaScript hosts a bunch of data types that we can use to perform different kinds of operations. Next, we'll move on to declaring variables inside of JavaScript. And I want you to think of variables for the time being as empty boxes. Okay, variables are containers, if you will. And then moving forward, we'll have a look at displaying our data from either our variables or through using functions and properties and so on. And it's going to be very primitive because again, this is just an introduction session to JavaScript. But before we get started with the actual content, here is a quick fun fact about JavaScript. And did you know that JavaScript is actually a higher level programming language? Like most programming languages out there, JavaScript is also high level. Now, what does that mean? You also get your low level languages like C, for example, which is built closer to communicating with your computer components such as your CPU. JavaScript, on the other hand, is very loosely typed and is quite dynamic and just makes programming a lot easier. And that is why it is such a favorite programming language among developers. Excellent. So without wasting any time, here is the first topic today, and that is JavaScript data types. Now, what exactly do we mean when we refer to data types in JavaScript? Well, you pretty much guessed it right, and a data type is exactly that. In programming languages, data types are quite important, and the reason for that is we can use data types and store them in variables so that we can perform some sort of computational operation at a later stage. Now, data types are different with different programming languages, but most, if not all, programming languages share similar data types, and this includes things such as strings. Now, a string is just a row of characters or accumulation of characters like your name or your surname. We can also store things such as integers, that's another data type, floats, which is decimal points, and so on. Data types vary depending on the kind of operation that you would like to perform with them. So then, what are some of the data types that currently exist or that comes built in with JavaScript? Well, first of all, we have strings, and a string is just another term for saying one or more characters. And again, this could be a mixture of numbers as well as text, such as your name with your age in it. Okay, we also have integers and floats. Now, integers and floats are generally known as numbers in JavaScript, which is numerical data. Okay, either whole numbers, that being an integer, and floats being your decimal point numbers. We also have booleans, which is a value that is either true or false. I want you to think of it such as that it could be a light switch that could be on or off, for example. Very simple and straightforward, right? But these are extremely powerful when it comes to using them alongside with conditionals. We also have nulls, and a null is intentionally leaving something absent in order to have a empty variable. Okay, I want you to think of it like an empty box. Now, a null is not something that you can use for arithmetic operations such as minus, plus, multiplication, addition, and all of these things. But when we start to play around with nulls later on, you'll see what we mean. And then lastly, we have undefined values or variables. And an undefined variable is a variable that has not been given any sort of data. Okay, this is not the same as a null. And again, it will all make sense as we progress. Now, we also have these things called arrays as well as objects, but these are things we'll cover at a later stage when we start playing around with the more complex data types in JavaScript. Excellent. Now, here are some examples of data types in JavaScript and how we can use them. So in this image over here, what we have in each row is a variable that we are creating, and we are assigning a value to that variable. There is an instance where we are not assigning anything, and that's the undefined. So let's have a look at the first one. In the first instance, we have this variable called number1. We've assigned it a number of 16, or an integer of 16. Now remember, an integer is essentially a number. The same goes to say for the second one, number2. Our variable number2 has a value of 12.2, and this is considered a float, but still as a whole, it is considered a number. And then we have last name, which equals Johnson, and this is a string. And this is what we mean by string. It's basically more than one characters. You can mix and match a string to have characters as well as numbers, and I'll show you an example of this shortly. And then next we have a variable called empty, and the value here is undefined because we have not assigned any sort of value to this particular variable. We also have empty too. Here we've intentionally assigned a null value. Okay, so if we had to check these data types, empty and empty2, we'd get undefined and null respectively. Okay, then we have container1, which is 2 plus 3 plus Johnson. Okay, so what's happening here? So what is essentially occurring is that in our output, we are first adding the number 2 and then 3, and then we are adding the string Johnson. So ultimately this is going to be a string, but the computation will perform the arithmetic operation. Okay, and then we have container 2, which is slightly different. Now here we have 2 plus Johnson plus 3, and in this case it's treated as a string with no sort of computation whatsoever. Okay, so depending on how you are actually adding your operators, such as your addition or your multiplication and so on, it's going to determine what your string is going to look like in the output. And then we have 2 Boolean values, which is just set to true or either false. So you might be wondering what happens if you don't know the data type of a variable, and this is often the case when you have lengthy code. Well, you can simply use the type of operator to request the data type that's assigned to a variable, and here are a couple of examples. In our first instance, we have a variable x and we've given it a value of L. Then what we are doing is we are alerting the type of operator on the x variable, and the result we get is string. We're doing exactly the same for the second row, where we have variable x and we've set it to 121 or 121. We then call the alert function, and inside the type of operator we assign to the x variable, and then we get the result number. And the same holds true for the last 2 examples, where x is a Boolean and the last one, type of x, is just undefined because we haven't assigned any variable to it. Now moving on to our next topic, declaring JavaScript variables. And we've seen tons of examples where we've done this. We've even had a look in a previous lesson. But once again, let's just recap to make sure we are all on the same page. Now, by now, variables should be self-explanatory, but I think it's pretty important that we solidify our understanding by having a simplified definition. And essentially, variables are created to store data, okay? And some of this data might change, hence the name variable. So to declare a variable, we use the keyword var in front of the name of the variable. Now, let's break this down for a second. So when we say data might change, again, I want you to think of an empty box, okay? And sometimes you can take something out of a box, you can switch the item in the box, you can even take something out of the box and not replace anything in that box, okay? That is what a variable is. It's a container to hold some sort of data. And yes, variables can be changed at a later stage depending on the type of computational operation which you would like to perform. Now, in our previous lesson, we learned how to declare a variable. So let's just revisit that topic or that concept for a second. And essentially what we have here is just a variable that we are declaring. We haven't assigned any sort of value to this. And how we do this is we use the keyword var, which is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, and then followed by the name of the variable. In this case, my variable. And keep in mind, it's important that we always stick to camel case. Wonderful. So then what is this notion of assigning a value to a variable? Well, in programming, just like in algebra, for example, you could use variables in an expression. So you could say 1 plus 1, or you could say my variable 1 plus my variable 2 equals some sort of number. So you might want to get the total value of the 2 variables after adding them. And that's what we've done in this example over here. We have a variable called price1, we've set it equal to 5. We have a variable called price2, we've set it equal to 6. And then we have this variable called total, which is essentially price1 plus price2. And the total variable, or the variable named total, will have the sum of the 2 variables we created on top. Now, before we wrap up this session, let's have a look at what's coming up in our next lesson, lesson 3. In our next lesson, we explore the use of operators in JavaScript. Operators are an excellent way to perform arithmetic computation. It's also a core part of implementing conditional logic in our code. So come prepared with your thinking hats and be prepared for some basic algebra. Now for our very final topic for today, displaying data in JavaScript. And following this, we'll actually have a practical which will cover this exact topic. Now, when we refer to displaying data in JavaScript, what we essentially mean is displaying data in the client, otherwise known as our browser. And in JavaScript, we can easily store data in variables. We know this, but then what would be the point of that, right? So we do this so that we can actually work with that data and display that data in our client using the built-in mechanisms that come with our browsers. And this includes things like console logs and so on. But let's have a look at some basic approaches that we can use to display data from variables. And here is a list of a couple of those basic approaches that we can use to display data using those built-in mechanisms. First, we have the console log, which comes built in with our browser, and I'll demonstrate this in the practical following these couple of slides. And then we also have the alert system, which just alerts to the user like a pop-up. We also have the confirm system, which takes in some sort of input, and usually this would be a false or a true value that will be taken in, okay, a boolean value if you can remember correctly. And then lastly, we have the prompt system, which also accepts user input in the form of more flexible characters such as strings or numbers and so on. With that being said, let's dig a little deeper to see how each of these actually work. So first of all, we have the console, otherwise known as the console log. And here we have a very simple code snippet that says console.log with parentheses and the words hello world. Now the words hello world here is a string. We just didn't store it as a variable. And this is what the output looks like for that. Okay, so here we have this keyword or these two keywords hello world that's being shown or displayed in our console log. Okay, and I'll show you how to get to the console log again when we do our practical. Now we also have the alert function that's also built into JavaScript that we can use to display data. And here's an example of the code snippet. First, we create a variable called hello, and we set that variable equal to hello world. So essentially we're doing the same thing that we did in our previous example where we used hello world in console log. The only difference here is hello world is now assigned to a variable called hello, and then we call the alert function and we add the parameter hello, and this is what the output for that looks like. Okay, so this is essentially a pop-up in the user interface and not in the console log. Next up is the confirm function that we can call to display data. And here pretty simple, we just call the word confirm, we open our parentheses, and then we add the actual string we want to enter. In this case, we have, are you ready to become a full stack web developer? And then we close off the parentheses with a semicolon at the end. Okay, and this is what the output looks like for that. Now here it's slightly different because in our previous example, we only had this option of okay. In this example, in our user interface, we can say okay or we can cancel. Here we are either passing a true value or a false value. Again, otherwise known as a boolean. And then last but not least, we have the prompt function. And this works very similar to the confirm function. The only difference here is the user input is more flexible. So we call this function prompt, we open the parentheses, and we supply that exact same string, are you ready to become a full stack web developer? And then we close it off, and this is what the output looks like. Now, what I want you to take note of here is that here you can actually pass in user input. So instead of okay and cancel, a true or false value, you can pass in additional data, and that could be a string, it could be a number, and you can take it even further and process that data and send it to the database or do some sort of interactive function on your website. This is a really powerful way to not just display data, but also to accept user input. Now, with all that being said, it's time that we jump right into our code and start our practical. So without further ado, let's dive in. Now, before we get started with our practical, there is a new piece of software that I would love to take the time to introduce you to, and this is called JS Fiddle. This is something we mentioned briefly in our previous lesson. So what exactly is JS Fiddle then? Well, as stated here, it's a code playground. You can also think of it as a sandbox to test your JavaScript code. And this is quite fitting for what we want to achieve in this practical, especially because we are strictly going to be working with JavaScript. So for the time being, we will not be touching on HTML as well as CSS. We'll be working with JavaScript in isolation of those languages. And the nice thing about JS Fiddle is that it's an online IDE, unlike Atom that we used to, which means it's a cloud platform. Okay, so in the event that you really want to test your code in a robust manner, I would strongly suggest using JS Fiddle. Now let's actually take a second to explore the UI of JS Fiddle to see what we are going to be getting into. Also, if you want to find it online, you simply just run a search on JS Fiddle and it should be the first option that comes up. So if I click on this, it's going to take me straight to the user interface. Give it a second to load. Now, first of all, we have a block for HTML code over here. We've got a block for CSS code. We've got a block for the result that's going to be outputted as we write our code, and we've got a block for JavaScript code. Now, we will not be working with the HTML block, and we will not be working with the CSS block. What we will be working with is this JavaScript block over here. Also, you do want to make sure that your settings over here is set to JavaScript, no library, pure.js, or otherwise known as vanilla.js, because this is the only window we are going to be working with. And now that we've gone through all the admin, we can actually start writing our code. Now, the first thing we are going to be working with is outputting data using the console log. Okay, so I'm going to write my first line of code over here, console.log, and this is simply a method as per our discussion in outputting data. And I'm going to do something simple, something relatable. I'll say hello world. Okay, let's just make sure I've got sentence case. So what's going on over here before we even run this code? What we are doing here is we are accessing the console.log method, and we are providing a string parameter. So also very, very important when working with strings, you always want to ensure that you are including them in quotation marks over here. Okay, double quotation marks. So if I run this code now, it's going to throw an error, which I'm not going to do. But if I cut this out and let's just add those quotation marks again, you want to have double quotation marks when you are working with strings. This way the system recognizes this as a string and this as a function. Okay, strings are sensitive in the sense that you must always include your quotation marks. Now if I run this code, you can simply just click the run button over here. Nothing is going to happen. Okay, you would expect something to happen in the result block. This result block over here is reserved for using HTML, CSS, as well as JavaScript. But given that we are not working with HTML and CSS at all, we will never get any sort of result over here. The result, in fact, works differently. If you right-click anywhere in your browser, I'm working with Chrome in this case, and if I go to inspect over here, then what I'll get is a bunch of code over here and all of this. We don't have to worry about this for now. We'll inspect these things in future. What you really want to be visiting is this console tab over here. Okay, this is an element of the client window. It's an object of the client window. So what we're saying is, object of the client window, I want you to log something for me. And what is that thing that I want you to log? Hello world. So I'm calling a function and I'm providing the recipe or the ingredients for what I want to pass through this method or function, and I want it to be displayed. So where do I find that? Over here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear this over here because you might be getting a couple of errors that says unrecognized and dev tools failed. Ignore all of this. Okay, so I'll save that again, or I'll erase that, and then I'll run my code again. So once I run it, I get this thing called hello world on top. So I'm accessing the console log and I'm printing my string over here to my console log at the top. Now this is quite important because we will be working with the console log quite often. What we can also maybe do is just increase the font size of all of this. So let's have a look. We can simply go zoom. That way it appears just like so. The code should be visual, it should be viewable. Okay, I think that's a good size moving forward. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work with a variable here because I've simply passed this thing in here, which is not always ideal. Let's jump into variables. So I'm going to create a variable here at the bottom with the keyword var. Remember, this is how we create variables, and I'm simply going to name this variable hello. I'll set this to equal, and then I'll open the double quotation marks, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I've done before. I'm going to pass the string hello world. I can actually delete this, or I can comment this out. Commenting out uses / 2/ for single line comment. Okay, and I'll say, I'll just add my semicolon over there, and then I'll do exactly the same thing. Console.log, open my parentheses, because this is where I want to pass that recipe, that ingredient for this function to actually work. Okay, and I'll say hello. Now you'll notice I'm not saying hello world like I did on top over here. I'm saying hello. Why? Because I've created a variable named hello, and I've stored this string in my empty box called hello. Okay, so therefore it's no longer an empty box. Now what I can do is I can simply call console log and then pass the variable instead of passing hello world. Let's see what we actually get. So I'll clear my console once again. I'll hit run, and I'm getting the exact same result. Now, just to make sure the result that I'm getting is this hello variable I created over here, let's say hello world again, okay, for emphasis. So what I'll do is I'll clear on top, I'll run it again, and I'm 100% sure that the variable is actually being stored and called over here. Wonderful stuff. Now let's move on to something slightly more complex. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be working with the alert function. Okay, so I'll delete this over here. I'll maintain my variable. I'll delete the console log function. So I'll just paste this to the top maybe. So I've maintained my variable hello, which has a value assigned of hello world again. Now, how do we work with alerts? Much like we did in the slides previously. So I'll say alert. I'm calling the function alert, but the function needs a parameter. It needs an ingredient to work. So I'll simply pass in hello, and then I'll hit run at the top, and now I've got a pop-up instead of my console log over here. I can actually clear that, okay, because I don't need it anymore. Great stuff. Now what happens if I mess up my wording? Okay, this is quite important. This is a very important concept to understand. I can actually, let's click OK. I can actually change this to a capital H, and I can change all of these to capitals if I wanted to. But here again, I'm trying to prove a point. Now, if I hit run, I'm getting an error and no output whatsoever at the top. So why is this? Hello is not defined. So I've created the variable hello, but I've created it in such a manner, in a case sensitive manner, where it's all small caps, but here I'm calling it with sentence case. Okay, so I've never created this variable called hello with sentence case where the first letter is capitalized. Okay, so therefore it's not recognizing it, and therefore it's giving me this error that says not defined. So this is extremely important. This is an issue that you will most likely run into as your web development career progresses. Okay, so I'll just change that back, make sure everything's running just fine, and there we go. Hello world again. Seems to be working fine. I'll clear my error at the top. Now, what if I wanted to do something slightly more complex? I could easily do that by using concatenation. Just to make it slightly more interactive, I'm going to delete all of my code over here, and I'm going to create a new variable called my name. Remember, camel case, very important. And I'll set this equal to Rushan. Never forget the quotation marks because we're working with a string. I'll set this equal to Rushan Weingard and semicolon, and now I will say alert. Now here's the tricky part. So I'm going to add a string in here, but I'm going to concatenate that string with my variable. Concatenation is something we will cover, but I just want to show you how we can actually make things a little more interactive and a little more interesting. So I'm going to start off with a string. Now, regardless of having my string on top here, I'm going to create a new string in here, and keep in mind a string is a data type. So I'm going to say welcome back. Okay, I'll give it a space over here, and then I'll add a plus sign. Now, when working with strings, a plus sign is treated as concatenation, which means you are combining two strings, or you are combining a string with a number. Okay, very, very important. And again, this is something we will cover in future. Now, I'm saying welcome back in my alert. Okay, so I'm providing it with this string over here, and then I'm going to add the variable. So I'm going to concatenate the string I just created. I'm going to combine the string with my variable, and I'll simply say my name. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. So now we have welcome back Rushan. So we've combined this over here with our variable, which has this value in our alert function. Pretty awesome, right? Now, a little more complex, what we could also do is we could be working with things like prompts and confirms and so on. But before we even jump into that, let's work with numerics and see how they differ when we work with the plus sign when it's not strings, and instead we are using numerics like floats and numbers or even integers. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of my code over here, and I'm going to create a new variable called num1. And I'm going to assign a number over here, an integer of 5. Now, the nice thing about JavaScript is that you don't explicitly have to say that this is an integer. Okay, JavaScript already knows what all of this is, which makes it quite dynamic. I'll create another variable over here called num2. This is going to be my second number, and I will make this number, let's say 13. Let's assign the value 13 to it. Okay, now I'm going to alert the num1 num1 plus num2. Okay, now this is going to work differently because we are working with integers, whole numbers, and not strings. So let's run this and see what we get. Let's just make sure our code is correct. Num1, num2, num1 plus num2. Run the code, and now we get the value 18. Okay, so what essentially is happening here is we are not concatenating these numbers. We are not combining them in the sense that they are strings, but we are performing logical operations on it. Okay, we are performing some sort of mathematical computation on this number. So we can actually delete this, or we can do something a little more complex. What we can do is we can remove this. Let's combine our numbers with strings. Okay, so I'm going to say alert. I'll maintain my variables on top, and I'm going to say in a string, okay, don't forget your quotation marks, the sum of num1 and num2 is, just give it a space over here so that it's not pushed against the number that I'm going to get, and I'll add a plus sign here, which is going to be treated as concatenation, okay, because I'm combining a string with a number. Okay, the sum of num1 and num2 is, let's see what happens. So I'll say num1 plus num2. Now, before I even run this line of code, or these 3 lines of code, I'm going to get an error. Okay, or I'm not necessarily going to get the desired output, but I'm doing this intentionally because I want to pose a challenge to you to try to figure out how we can get the desired output. Now let's actually run this and see what we get. Not exactly what we want. What we expected is the sum of num1 and num2 is 18. Okay, because if you add 5 to 13, you would naturally get 18, correct? Now, what is the issue here? This is not something I want to solve right in this moment, but instead I want you to take the time to figure out how we can actually get the desired outcome, where instead of having 5, 1, 3, we have the value 18, the actual sum of these two numbers. And just so you know, we will be addressing this in our next lesson. But for the time being, take it on yourself as a challenge. Great stuff. Now we can actually move on to confirmation boxes. Okay, so if you remember, confirm boxes work slightly different than the rest because there actually is some sort of user input in the form of a Boolean value. So I'm going to delete this code and I'm going to write confirm. And again, this is a function or a method, so it requires some sort of parameter. Just end off with a semicolon. So I'll say, would you like to proceed with payment? And this is a notification that many of us are familiar with. So I'm asking a question in the form of a string. So confirm, would you like to proceed with payment? Okay, now let's run this. And it works just fine. If I click OK, nothing really happens. If I click cancel, nothing really happens. Okay. Now, if I want to make this a bit more interactive, what I can do is I can assign this method or function to a variable, which means this will be stored in an empty box, which would obviously no longer be empty. And then we can use that for future use. And this is the power when it comes to variables. So I will just cut this out and I'll say var question, or let's say confirm payment, Okay, then I will assign, let's just make sure I spelled this correctly. Lovely stuff, I did. So then I will assign this confirm, the one that I just cut, I will assign that to a variable. Okay, so now whatever the user passes in here is going to be stored in this variable. And then what I can do is I can say alert, and please alert whatever the result is of confirm payment. So I can say confirm payment. Okay, let's make sure the code is correct. So I've got my variable, I've set it to this confirm method over here. And let's actually just increase this over here so that it looks like a full sentence. And let's just give it a bit of space. I am quite pedantic when it comes to the format of my code. You will have to forgive me for that. Now I'll run my code and see what happens, because previously we did not get any sort of output. So if I run this, would you like to proceed with payment? If I click OK, it's going to say true. Okay. If I run this again and I say cancel, it's going to say false. So what's happening here? So when I run the code, these two buttons over here hold specific values, either true or false, which means it's a Boolean value. Okay, and again, Booleans are really, really awesome. and they work particularly well when it comes to conditional logic. So again, we can capture the user's response. It would either be true or it would either be false. Now, if we are looking for something slightly more flexible, we can work with prompts. Okay, so I'll delete the code over here and I will start typing out my new function, which is prompt. Okay, this is just another way of displaying data. And I'm going to copy and paste what I have. And the question that I have here is slightly different from the previous one. So open my quotation marks, paste the question. Are you ready for a brand new day of possibilities? Well, I definitely am. So if I run this code and I click OK, or if I type in a bunch of gibberish, whatever the case is, nothing is going to happen. Okay. But what can I do to avoid this? What can I do to make this more flexible? Again, just like with the confirm box that we were working with earlier, we can actually assign this to a variable. So I'm going to cut this out and I'm going to create a new variable called question equals whatever the result is of the prompt that the user passes in. Okay. And again, this is a lot more flexible than working with a confirm box. So what I'll do next is just bring this over here. Just space that out. And I'm going to say alert whatever the user passes in as a result. Now, previously with confirm, we could only go with true or false or okay and cancel. Okay. Which is not always ideal. So what I'll say is alert the question. Okay, alert the result of whatever the user passes in. So if I run this over here, are you ready for a brand new day? Yes, I am. And if I click that, it's going to give me the response that I passed in. Yes, I am. We can take it a step further and we can pass it into an alert, and we can even do a console log. So I'm going to say console dot log, and I will pass that exact same parameter question, which is our variable. And if I run it now, what I get is, are you ready for a brand new day of possibilities? Yes, I so am. Wonderful. So if I run this now, I have this response over here, which is yes, I so am. And if I click OK, I also have that very same response in my console log. Okay, now this is just a brief introduction to what we are actually able to do with JavaScript, and I really hope this sums up how we declare variables, how we work with variables, and how we can display data to the user. As we move forward, later lessons are going to become a lot more complex because we will be including things like our HTML code, our CSS code, and actually getting an output. But it's quite important that you understand the importance of JavaScript and what makes it so engaging and interactive when building full websites. Excellent. Now, I do hope that you found that practical session quite useful. In the event that you want to access the source code, you will be able to find it in the summary notes. I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.